It's nice to see everybody, and look forward to a meaningful day. Many we have 7 hours straight of room. Anybody stays for all 7 hours, send me an email at the end. We'll give you a present, a reward. But it's a pleasure to kick off with Dr. Yehuda Mirsky, who I go back to our days in Yeshiva University, and the amazing articles he used to write in the student newspaper. You had to have a dictionary sometimes, and he was really an intellectual par excellence. He's had a very varied and fascinating career, many talents. He's now a professor at Brandeis University of Judaic Studies, and he just moved back to Israel after spending a number of years in America. He had made Aliyah, and he was back, and now he's back in Israel, and was teaching at Brandeis, and it's really a pleasure to welcome him here to kick off our first talk. He, of course, wrote a book on Rav Kook, and so it's a pleasure. Rav Kook, of course, I think relates much to Tisha B'Av, and B'vakasha, Dr. Mirsky, it's all yours.
Well, thank you, Rabbi Kelman, and thank you, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here. I mean, and to see old friends and new friends and all. So, in thinking about, Rabbi Kelman asked me to think about something for Tisha B'Av, yes, Rav Kook, the great apostle of love of one's fellow Jews, as he famously said, Ahavat Yisrael hi miktzah gedolah b'Torah. Ahavat Yisrael, loving other Jews, isn't just a nice thing to do, though of course it's a nice thing to do, but it's an important subject in Torah, and it's something that's worthy of study and worthy of thought, and it's not just something that you wake up in the morning and do, right? And one's relationship with other Jews and other, with one's fellow Jews, one's fellow humanity, is a topic, is something to think about, something to think about and study, and then put into practice in all sorts of ways. And in particular, I wanted to talk about some of Rav Kook's ideas about anger. Anger is certainly appropriate to Tisha B'Av. Sinat Chinam is, of course, one way of living anger. And also, frankly, because, not to get too contemporary about it, but it's hard to miss that we're living in an age of anger, in a very angry age. People are angry all over the place. People are angry on all sides of the political barricades. Sometimes when you try to have conversations with people, the main response seems to be, be quiet. Can't you see I'm trying to be angry here? Why don't you just want to let me be angry? And it goes even deeper. I mean, the fact that so many of us live on the internet and live in social media, and in the world of the internet and social media, anger drives clicks. The angrier something makes people, like happy cat videos get 1,000 clicks, and things that make people furious get 100,000 clicks. And it's something like it's the devil's own business model. It's governing social media. And so I thought that it would be a good idea to talk a bit about Rav Kook's ideas on anger, which are interesting. He comes at it from a somewhat different perspective than we often think of, and one very much worth pondering. I see that some people, including David Freudenstein, have raised their hand, and I hope it doesn't mean that you're not hearing me well.
Yeah, I think a few people have mentioned you could speak a little bit louder into the mic. There's a little bit of interference.
Okay. So I tell you what, let me try putting in the
that was a little better, but
yeah,
I think
let me just see if this helps. Very briefly. Yeah. So is this any better? Do you hear me better?
I think so.
Yes, I hope so. Okay. Well, anyway, we'll be able to read the text. So, we'll Rav Kook do the talking. You won't be so dependent on me. So, a few brief words. As we know, Rav Kook, Rav Avram Yitzchak HaKohen Kook, born in 1865 in what today is Latvia, but then for purposes of Jewish history is essentially Lita, Lithuania, and passes away in 1935. He comes on Aliyah in 1904 and is the chief rabbi of Yafo V'Hamoshavot, which is to say chief rabbi of the new Yishuv, the new Eretz Yisrael. In 1919, he becomes chief rabbi of Jerusalem, and in 1921, the first Ashkenazi chief rabbi. Before then, there had been Sephardic chief rabbis under the Ottomans. and the founder of the Israeli Rabbinate as we know it. Now, as many of you know, and as some of you have probably heard me say, the best known facts about Rav Kook are sort of the ones I just mentioned. Founder of the Israeli Chief Rabbinate, and sort of the most distinguished theologian and thinker of religious Zionism, the most important foundational thinker of religious Zionism. Now that's true, but in some ways, as I often say, those are the least among the less interesting things about it, certainly for our purposes today. Like all thinkers, all human beings, but just thinkers, write these things down. Rav Kook stood at a crossroads. On the one hand, inheriting ideas, traditions, texts, responsibilities that had been passed down to him from his teachers and from the entirety of Jewish history. And finding himself in a specific historical moment, in a specific time and place, which is to say, the revolutionary circumstances of Jewish life in late 19th century, early 20th century, first Eastern Europe, and then Palestine, Eretz Israel. A time when, a remarkable collapse of Jewish communal life, mass migrations, full-blown rebellions against traditional authority, and also a time of remarkable creativity, the creation of Zionism, which to some people was, like the great movement of Jewish national liberation. To many religious people, of course, it was an outright catastrophe. The renaissance of the Hebrew language, Hebrew literature, Jewish arts, Jewish thought, not only in Hebrew, also in Yiddish. So like a period of like remarkable creativity and remarkable ferment alongside remarkable difficulty. And one of the things that's amazing about Rav Kook is that he put himself in the middle of all of this and tried to articulate a stance that would affirm the past, the present, and the future as part of God's world. In a sense, Rav Kook was like all Jews, but certainly all Kabbalists, deeply committed to the proposition stated very succinctly in the Zohar, specifically in Tikkunei Zohar. Let atar panui minei la ilaha v'la tata. There is no space empty of him, of God, neither above nor below. So if God is everywhere, and God is in the world, and the world is in God, then God has to be present in the terrible confusions of modernity. I can't just say God has left the building. What's more, and here Rav Kook, through a mix of his own learning and a remarkable personal journey, opens himself up to the people around him. There's a crucial bit of biographical fact. We know that Rav Kook, when he was young, learned in the yeshiva in Volozhin, right? Great yeshiva, the jewel in the crown of rabbinic learning, certainly European rabbinic learning in the 19th century. His classmates in Volozhin at the time, people who were literally in the same machzor with him in Volozhin, some of them went on to become great, certified gedolim, like Rav Isser Zalman Meltzer, right? And Zelig Reuben Benges, and others went on to become full-blown Zionist revolutionaries. Like one of Rav Kook's classmates in Volozhin was none other than Michi Yosef Berdichevsky, who was the enfant terrible of early Hebrew literature, who was the guy who literally and figuratively translated Nietzsche into Hebrew, who was the first one to lay squarely on the table that Zionism was a revolution against Jewish history, right? Berdichevsky says, we have to decide, will we be, and this is the last words, will we be the last Jews or the first Hebrews, right? He's clearly voting for the first Hebrews. And what was one of the things that's remarkable about Rav Kook is that from his experiences in his youth and his experiences as a communal rabbi in Eastern Europe, he listened to people and he realized that what were out and out rebellions against tradition were being done by people who themselves were very serious human beings, right? If I were to, if you take a look at if I were to put in very colloquial terms Rav Kook's argument with his rabbinic peers about how to treat people like the Chalutzim in Palestine or the Jewish socialists in Russia, you know, if he were to put it in terms of today, he would say, Rabbi Isai, you know, these people who are rebelling against us, they're not just because they want to eat cheeseburgers. They're not looking for easier lives. Like, you know, they're rebelling against us, and they're moving to Palestine and draining swamps and being shot at by Arabs. And they're trying to like build these cooperatives that like do social justice. The ones who are staying in Europe are fighting against the Tsar. They're fighting against tyranny. They're willing to be sent to Siberia. They're idealists. And what's more, when they say that we have not done a good enough job taking care of the Jewish poor, they're right. When they say that our religious ideas have not kept pace with sort of like that our religious ideas have sort of stood still while the rest of the world is moving forward, they're right. Unlike them, Rav Kook doesn't say, okay, let's throw out the old. He says, let's dig deeper into the tradition. And he finds in the tradition resources for dealing with the world, for dealing with this very complex world, and very much in the Kabbalah. Because, I mean, this isn't a shiur in the Kabbalah, but, you know, if so much of the Kabbalah is seeing vital forces at work in the world, even if they seem to disagree with one another, right? And you don't even have to go to Kabbalah. Think about like everyone who's ever read Rashi and Chumash learns about Midat HaDin and Midat HaRachamim, right? That there's a principle of din, of judgment, of severity in the world, which we'll meet in some of these sources, as well as Rachamim, mercies, right? And the way the Kabbalah sees it, it's not just that one day God decides to be this and one day God decides to be that. These are forces that are active in the world, and they're active in human beings, and they work through us. Right? Because our inner lives, our souls, are part of the soul of the world, which is larger than all of us. And Kabbalah develops this in great length, and also and Rav Kook is part of certain schools of thought of Kabbalah, which crucially see these different dynamics, especially coming from the school of the Ramchal or the Moshe Chaim Luzzatto, which sees these divine forces and dynamics as actually working through historical time and historical processes. So, Rav Kook puts himself, by coming to Eretz Yisrael and being the kind of rabbi that he wants to be, puts himself in the middle of an extremely conflictual situation, right? The arguments between the religious and the non-religious, among the different camps, within the religious camps, within the non-religious camps in Eretz Yisrael, are brutal, and they get more brutal over time. And then the world becomes pretty brutal, because in 1914 you have World War I. And World War I, as it turns out, just a few weeks before the outbreak of World War I, he travels to Europe to attend an Agudat Yisrael conference, as well as to seek medical treatments for his wife, the Rebbetzin Rivka, and himself. And he's stranded in Europe for World War I. He manages to avoid being put in a German internment camp as a Russian national. And he spends part of the war in Switzerland and then much of it in London before returning to Eretz Yisrael. So he gets something of a front row seat at the collective suicide of Europe in World War I. And this also, as we're going to see, influences his thought about things. And so what I've put together here, and at this point, I'd like to share screen and start putting the texts up. Can we do this? Can you see the texts here?
It's up already. Yeah, you have.
It's up already.
Great. Yeah.
So how about I'll just minimize myself here, but you can still hear me talking, Neva, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's okay. So so we'll start looking at some of these texts here. Now, what I have the text here. I have them in a few sections. The roots and place of anger in a fundamentally good world is part one. How to think about disagreements in Torah, politics, and society. So first, is just sort of scrolling through here so you see what we have, and then forgiveness for oneself in the world. So the idea is that first we're going to go, if you will, the metaphysical side of this. How does anger happen in a fundamentally good world and in God's world? How does one think about anger in general? Why do people become angry? And when anger seems to take people over, why is that? And then how Rav Kook sort of takes these ideas or you see how these ideas have developed as part of his thinking through disagreements, both disagreements within the world of Torah, disagreements starting with the idea of machloket on any given page of the Talmud, and working through disagreements in politics and society. Then I close with forgiveness as sort of like a spiritual minded coda to how sort of to encase all of these ideas. So the sources from which we're drawing, you'll notice there's this thing here that's listed as Shmona Kvatzim, and then this thing is Orot HaKodesh. One of the that was distinctive about Rav Kook as a thinker is that much of his writing took the form of spiritual diaries. Spiritual diaries are fairly commonplace among Christian thinkers. In Islam, I'm not sure, but certainly in Christianity, yes. And for a bunch of reasons, in the history of Jewish thought, we tend not to have spiritual diaries or spiritual journaling, but we do with him. I mean, it's a whole other conversation, how and why. But the point is twofold. One, so much of Rav Kook's thought comes from his own personal reflection and his own sort of excavating his ideas and his thoughts. This is also meant as a note of reassurance. Often when you're reading Rav Kook, you think, gee, this is so complicated. Why is he making it so complicated? And sort of, it's okay. It's not about you, because he wasn't writing for you. He was writing for himself, right? He wasn't trying to make it complicated. He wasn't trying to make it difficult. He was working out his own ideas. And then so much of what we have is his canon of scholarly works, especially these works titled Orot and Orot HaKodesh, were edited by others. Almost all of them, we'll start with Orot HaKodesh, was edited by his disciple Rabbi David Kohen HaNazir, who was also the people in his immediate circle, the one who also had a university education. And the others, most all of them were edited by his son Rav Tzvi Yehuda Kook, Orot HaTshuva, Saravicha, all these other texts. Shmona Kvatzim was a collection of 8 notebooks that contain an exceptionally rich source of his journaling from the years 1910 to 1919. They are the 8 notebooks from which the Nazir developed the 4 volumes of Orot HaKodesh. And starting in 1999, they began to be published in their original form. So the advantage is that now we have, so often you'll see works of Rav Kook cited the way they're cited here, first is Shmona Kvatzim and then Orot HaKodesh. This means this appears in both places. It's helpful because you have the texts in their original. Also, once the texts are all put together, you can see like in a broader sweep what he's working with. For instance, there's a long-standing argument in Rav Kook studies, is he more of a, how deeply indebted was he to the Kabbalah? Because often he's not using explicit Kabbalistic terminology. Once we have the notebooks, we see, no, the Kabbalistic terminology is all over the place. So like, there's no doubt he's deeply immersed in the Kabbalah. I mean, we knew it before, but just makes it absolutely clear. Second, because the Kvatzim are dated, we know when they were written. So you see this one, Shmona Kvatzim, Kovetz Aleph, and for Shmona Kvatzim, we list them by Piskaot, by paragraphs as they've been published. So I can tell you this is written roughly in 1910. So by this point, he's been in Eretz Yisrael for 6 years and has had his share of public disagreements. At any rate, so now let's start in the text. So the idea here is that, and those of you who can follow in the Hebrew, great, but I'll be reading mainly in the English. And please pardon the occasional typo. So supreme holiness, HaKdusha Yonah, is full of love, compassion, and savlanut, which we ordinarily translate as tolerance, but I sort of translate it as empathic acceptance. I think that's what he means. I'm not sure. I know that he knew the word savlanut in its context, but I for a bunch of reasons, this is how I translate it here. So also, I think it conveys what he means by tolerance. Supreme holiness is full of love, compassion, and empathic acceptance from the abundant splendor of its sheer completeness. Shlemuta, which also has the word peace. Hold on to that word peace, because again, it's going to be very important for him that one, like Shmi Hashem Shalom, one of God's names is peace, which God, and later on we're going to see how he takes the idea of peace. Peace is a kind of also wholeness in which nothing is left out. What about hatred, judgment, severity? Are consequences of forgetting God and the dying of the life of the holy. Because what is the Kodesh? For Rav Kook, in a sense, the Kodesh is the ultimate harmonious unit of all things, union of all things. And he regularly uses the word Kodesh as a noun. we're used to like kedusha is sort of like a predicate, like some kedusha, holiness is something that something has, right? But for him, kodesh is the subject. There is this thing, kodesh. It's a thing, and kedusha is a manifestation of it, and much of it is the ultimate harmony of things. Like a great example, we don't wear shatnez, but who wears shatnez? The Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippur wears shatnez. Right? Holiness is an ultimate harmonious completeness of everything in God's world, right? And love and compassion and acceptance of other people is an acting out of the holy, which is to say the wholeness and completeness of God's world, right? And hatred, separating people, severity, judging other people severely, too severely, are consequences of forgetting God, forgetting sort of like the dying of the light of the holy, of compassion. Rav Kook was somebody who preached love, but he also had powerful words to say about hatred, right? This is one of the only times I've spent a lot, as Rabbi Kelman indicated, I've spent a lot of time with Rav Kook's writings over the years. He mentioned this. I have a couple or more books coming out on him shortly, for better or worse. So I've spent a lot of time with his writings, and you almost never find him saying, I hate something, or we should hate something. And this is one of the only times he says that. We must, oh, here we are. We must hate anger with all the depth of our being. With great anger, but moderate and settled, we must hate the spiritual anger. You see, anger, the Torah sometimes tells you to be angry, right? Like God gets angry, Moshe gets, he has what to say about Moshe getting angry, but sometimes we need to get angry with something. Anger can be helpful. Anger can like stimulate us to right wrongs, to take matters in hand, to correct injustices. But the anger has to be like moderate and settled. Anger has to be like directed towards a goal, and towards a goal that's ultimately one of peace. But we must hate the spiritual anger that jumbles the mind and invalidates or undoes all the advantages of being human, individual, and collective. And this is a point where a Kook could be talking about today. When we see any group always expressing itself in anger, it's a sign that it has no understanding, no content with which to fill its emptiness, that in truth it's angry with itself, but that egoism, and that's the word he uses, comes and forces it to deposit the venom of its anger on others. The higher sages who have reached the height of justice and kindness are full of will, and kindness and truth garland them all the day. So Rav Kook is saying that there's a kind of anger that is wholly negative, and it's anger that doesn't express itself in anything constructive. Anger that's just about tearing things down and tearing people down and expressing anger and bitterness and not offering constructive ideas, and people are just being angry all the time and they're in a constant volume of anger. It means there's nothing inside, right? Anger is from the Sitra Achra. Anger is from the other side. Anger is from the devil. Because why? And it's nothingness, right? It's nothingness, it's void, it's nihilistic. Because God is about building, and God is about constructing good things in the world, right? And this is a powerful statement when he says that people, because they're still human beings, if you have nothing inside you, so why didn't you just enjoy? But no, because human beings want something. They want something affirmative and positive. And when they feel their own emptiness, and when people feel their own emptiness and they don't know what to do with it, so they just turn the emptiness out onto others, right? And egoism comes to force it to deposit the venom of its anger on others. If you feel empty inside, well, the problem can't be me, it has to be somebody else. If I don't know what to do with my life, that has to be somebody else's fault. If I'm unsure of my place, that has to be somebody else's fault. If things aren't going well for me, that has to be somebody else's fault. Rather than like actually looking carefully at oneself, looking at one's place in society. And what's interesting is when Rav Kook says do away with anger, you might wonder, it's an odd locution, isn't it, when he says the higher sages who have reached the height of justice and kindness are full of will, right? In the Hebrew, mila'ei ratzon heim, I mean, that seems a little odd, right? Because if he's talking about like the higher sages who are full of kindness, you don't think of that as like a lot of will, do you? Right? You think of it as like they should be nice, they should be gentle, they should be flowing, they should be, but what's this will? The will, it's another striking feature in Rav Kook's thought, and one that he takes from the Kabbalah and elements in modern philosophy. Rav Kook is a strong proponent of the will. It's often when people don't understand. Rav Kook loved everybody and he was very tolerant and all that kind of thing, which is true. And he was willing to like accept a lot of abuse that was heaped on him. My grandmother, Alea Shalom, had a cousin, one of the Jerusalem fanatics, who like threw a pail of water in Rav Kook's face one day when he was walking by, and he bragged about it to the end of his days. And he accepted all this abuse. But it was with a very powerful sense of will. In the Kabbalah, God's Ratzon is often identified as the very beginning of creation. Before God had to create the will, before God could create the world, God had to want to create the world. Right? On the Metzach, on the forehead of the Kohen Gadol, he wears a tzitz. Why? Liratzon lifnei Hashem. And the way that's understood in the Kabbalah, it's not just like to find favor within God. That the mind, the beginning where everything starts, is Ratzon, is will. One of the things that's striking about Rav Kook as a religious thinker is that many religious thinkers, especially certain versions of the Musar schools, are very much about weakening the human will, right? You need to submit, you need to bend yourself, you need to break yourself. And Rav Kook is, no, religious life means strengthening the will. Without a powerful will to live, you can't have a religious life. Without a powerful will to make the world good, you can't have a religious life. The Torah seeks to strengthen your will and make it a will for good. To will the good. Right? And ideally, latit lavo, you know, in Kabbalah it says, in Chazal, and the way it's understood in Kabbalah, in the time of Mashiach, you know, tam ha'etzia ketam ha'pri, right? So, like, you know, the fruit will taste as good as the bark. What does that mean? How does Rav Kook understand that? It means that, like, you know, ideally we should do the good as simply as we breathe. I shouldn't have to choose. I shouldn't have to like be neurotic about it. You know, should I be a good person? Should I not be a good person? You should just be a good person, ideally. Now, you know, you can't just say, okay, I'm a good person. You have to get there. We have to train the will. But the idea is to have a good will. And it's a will that's full of kindness and truth. And in other words, and sort of like, and such that what emerges from here is that somebody who's angry all the time, that's sort of like, it's a parody of the will. Or it's a farcical version of the will that's deeply destructive, right? And it's always, and just like when we're arguing with people, okay, but then, you know, people want to argue all the time, fine. I mean, I know I've found this in arguments where people have said this to me if I'm getting very angry, and people say, well, what exactly do you want? Well, then now I need to think, right? When I've been in arguments with people who are getting furiously angry about this or that, and then if you just say, okay, well, what do you propose? Well, then everybody disagrees with me, die. I mean, that's not really an answer, right? Just pausing that. And then think about what so much of what goes on online these days, just people tearing each other down without actually offering anything constructive. No, let's actually, there's a problem. I know there's a problem. We have a problem here. Let's talk about our problem. Now, another way of looking at anger, the dregs that gather inside oneself and burst out in the form of bad traits, cunning, base lusts, angers, and animosities, are instances of the dregs at large in the world. Again, for Rav Kook, anger is a force in the world. Goodness is a force in the world. Kindness is a force in the world. Hatred is a force in the world. There are things we know and we feel inside us, but our inner life is also part of the world at large. Our inner life is our own, and again, part of one of Rav Kook's innovations as a thinker is to validate the internal life, to say that you should listen to your own rachashei lev. Indeed, on a biographical note, one of the things that really helped Rav Kook develop these ideas was something that he discovered himself when he was a young rabbi in shtetl in Lithuania in the 1890s. He was a young, proper Litvish Talmud Chacham who discovered that he loved learning Agadata. You know, he loved learning Ein Yaakov. He loved all the parts, all the sugyot in the Gemara that you're supposed to skip if you're a proper Talmud Chacham, right? The things that in yeshiva were said, you know, they were said like, you know, yeah, Agadata, that's what we teach women and children. It's not for serious people. Berdichevsky, in his memoirs of Volozhin, talks about how in Volozhin, you know, the Netziv insisted that you had to learn every Agadata. So the Netziv, the Rosh Yeshiva, insisted that like you learn the entire Gemara, including the Agadah, including the folk remedies, including everything. Also in Volozhin, parenthetically, there was, in Volozhin, the greatest of the yeshivas, there wasn't this thing, the yeshivish Masechto. Like, you know, the half a dozen Masechtot that all the yeshivot learned, you know, Bava Kama and like, you know, Gittin and Kedushin and stuff. And in Volozhin, they learned them ala Seder the whole way through. Also Brachot, also Moed Katan, also Nazir, also whatever. Anyways, the Netziv said you learn all that, but in the Beit Midrash and Volozhin, they would make fun of it. Okay, got it. So the Netziv, the Rosh Yeshiva says we have to learn this. Let's do it. Let's make fun of it. Let's this and that. And he finds that he likes this stuff. He loves it. He loves learning it. He loves teaching it. He loves writing about it. And he writes about this in his journals, right? And he says, well, I guess God made me this way. Maybe human beings, like when Chazal say, like, L'olam shilmad adam Torah mimkom shelibo chafetz, there's something very deep there that, like, maybe you should, if God really wants you to, like, do something with your life, don't say, well, there's the religious life, there's the God life, and then this is what I really want to do. No, discover your own will, because it comes from God too, right? And he said, well, God, so then I really need to, like, take this Agadah, because also then the upshot of this is then whatever you're doing, take it seriously. Well, if I'm learning Agadah, then I really need to do it seriously. Then I really need to give it some thought. And as we're going to see, he writes this massive commentary on the Agadah. So here too, he's saying to pay attention. He's saying to always says to attend to your inner life, but also see it as part of something larger in the world. In his case, God wants me to learn Agadah because whatever it is that I get from learning Agadah is something that God wants in the world. And so too, anger, the dregs that gather inside oneself and burst in the form of bad traits, cunning, base lust, animosities are instances of the dregs at large in the world. And every softening that softens the dregs in a person, in oneself, in the depth of his soul, by bettering traits, and even more by the light of Torah and the elevation of prayer, raising up the light of the holy, softens the dregs at large, and the cosmic forces of severe judgment are made sweet. Because these forces of anger are afoot in the world and they take root in the soul, it's a reciprocal relationship. If I do something to work on my own midot, I haven't just done something for myself, I've done something for the world. I've done something for the world in terms of how I'll be interacting with other people. But I've also done something for the world in terms of, yes, Rav Kook is somebody who believes that there's something that we call spiritual energies afoot in the world. And if I have like taken away some of the anger and I've added a bit of goodness in my own inner life, I've done something for the world. Now, in this next passage, written roughly 1918, so now he's also going to be referring to his experience watching World War I. The inner meaning of anger derives from the absence of spiritual creativity, right? People want to create. People want to do things. People want to live lives that are meaningful. They want to live lives that are meaningful both in their spiritual lives and in their physical lives, right? Rav Kook is somebody, part of his validation of Zionism is as he says regularly, like you can't have Kodesh without Chol, right? You can't have a soul without a body. The Jewish people need a body the same way they need a soul, and the body is not just some appendage to be discarded. It's part of the binyan as well, right? So people need creativity. They need to build their worlds in themselves. And the inner meaning of anger derives from the absence of spiritual creativity. The assemblage of spiritual forces waiting to realize themselves in distinct form and beauty, press the soul and wound her with inner agitation. Like your soul has energies and they don't know where to go. They don't know how to channel themselves. All the wars of the nation, all the murder and robbery among men, down to the fury of animals, from the snake's viper to the bite of the tiniest insect meant to wound, comes from the anger at large, pent up in the world, from pent up creative energy. And the more spiritual creativity expands, the more the pools of expansive mindfulness branch out in their vigorous strength, the more the Torah expands in majesty, peace is multiplied in the world. And he quotes the verse from Yeshayahu, if he holds fast to my refuge, he will be at peace with me, he will make peace with me. So part of this passage, he's reflecting in part on World War I. Now, World War I, an absence of spiritual creativity, it sounds crazy, but if you take a look, I mean, a great book to read on this, those of you who want, who have The Rites of Spring by an historian named Modris Eksteins, Eksteins. It's just one book among many that talks, that it's like a cultural history of World War I. And astonishing as it sounds in retrospect, at the outbreak of World War I, almost everybody thought it was a good idea, including Jewish thinkers. There was this sense in the decade before World War I that Europe was coming into this time of ennui, that everything was dull, everything was settling into this placid, bourgeois, mundane way of life, and we needed something to shake ourselves up. And when World War I began, all these philosophers, thinkers, intellectuals thought, this is great. This is going to be an explosion of vital energies. This is going to be incredibly creative. And even St. Martin Buber wrote like that. Hermann Cohen wrote like that. In some ways, even Rav Kook wrote like that. If you take a look in the book O Roth, the chapters Hamilchama, and those of you who are familiar with the corpus, everybody said, people read Rav Kook and it's like Hamilchama, and like he's talking about war, like all kinds of things happen in war, and war can sometimes be great, and you're reading like, what is this? When he published that in 1920, it was clear that he was talking about World War I. Right? When he published O Roth in 1920, this is important because Tzviuda kept publishing it Hamilchama, as if it's a statement about war in general. It was a statement about World War I. And at the beginning of World War I, Rav Kook said, well, government's going to topple, maybe something good will happen in the world. He does, in the course of the war, register the horror. For him, the horror is somehow redeemed by the Balfour Declaration. It's not without its problems, and it's something I go into in one of my forthcoming books on it. But when he talks about, it's not Stam in the Weltrein, he's saying that wars and the kind of anger that you see in war results from a void of spiritual creativity. You could say Bididi Hava Uvda. I was in Europe, World War I broke out, and everybody was saying, wow, this is great, it'll get our creative juices going. And so there's a pent-up energy in the world, there's a creative energy in the world, and if this creative energy finds a good outlet, people won't get angry because they'll feel that they are building. They won't feel stymied, they won't feel stifled. So these are all large, nice ideas. How do you actually think about that in terms of life? Descending from the metaphysical heights. So here's a passage written a bit earlier, but very of a piece with everything we're talking about. At least I think it was written earlier. From Rav Kook's Ein Ayah, which is his commentary to Ein Yaakov, to the Agadot of Chazal. It appears in 4 volumes, and what he was able to finish in his lifetime were Masechtot Brachot and most of Shabbat and Masechet Peah. And Peah is the Agadot in Yerushalmi. So here in Masechet Brachot, we'll read the English, but he begins with, it also appears in his Sidur commentary, Olat Riyah, which was put together by Tzviuda. Most of it, if you take a look in Rav Kook's Sidur commentary, Olat Riyah, most of it, Rav Kook started writing the Sidur commentary around the time of the Balfour Declaration. He sort of petered out at about, around Ashrei, and the rest was filled in by Tzviuda from elsewhere, mainly from Ein Ayah and Masechet Brachot. So, a line that we're all very familiar with from the Sidur, Amar Rabbi Elazar, Amar Rabbi Chanina, Talmidei Chachamim Marbim Shalom Ba'olam, Shneimar B'chol B'nayich L'mdei Adonai V'rav Shalom B'nayich, right? Al Tikri B'nayich Ela B'nayich. Right, we're all familiar with this from the Sidur. So, there's a question. How do sages increase peace in the world? As I said earlier, open up a page of the Gemara, and what it is, it's a record of disagreements. Right? Walk into a Beit Midrash, and what do you find? People arguing with one another. Where exactly is the peacefulness in this? Rav Kook says, some err and think that world peace will only be built by a uniform tone of ideas and qualities. And thus, when they see sages investigating in wisdom and in so doing multiplying views and opinions, they think they are thereby sowing discord, the opposite of peace. Right? And in truth, this is not so. For true peace can only emerge through the full shape of multiplied peace, which includes all the sides and opinions contained within wisdom, as well as its becoming clear that each has a place, each according to its value, location, and content. Indeed, as for all matters which seem redundant or contradictory, when the true wisdom in all its dimensions is revealed, all will see that only by virtue of the gathering of all the parts and all the particulars, and all the seemingly different opinions and divided subjects, precisely through them, there will emerge the light of truth and justice, and the knowledge of and reverence and love for God, and the light of the Torah of truth. Peace is the unification of all opposites, but there must first be opposites to work with and be unified. Thus, peace is the name of the Holy Blessed One, who is the master of all powers, forces, energies. Hakol Yachol V'chol Olam Yachad. May his great name be blessed forever and ever. So, on a mundane level, there's a machloket in the Gemara, right? How do you burn chametz? How do you do biur chametz? Right? So one shita is that you have to burn it. The other is, no, achman forer v'zorah l'ruach, you just sort of take it and toss it to the winds, right? Why did two shitot? Well, maybe one shita, maybe achman forer v'zorah l'ruach says that I just actually have to destroy, just get rid of it. Just make sure, just disassemble it. And then maybe the shita that says I have to burn it, no, I physically have to destroy the chametz. Why don't I physically have to destroy the chametz? What is it about chametz? Well, maybe, so you see, like, there's a machloket in the Gemara about how you do one specific mitzvah, right? And that opens up into like all sorts of different thoughts about what this mitzvah is. Is it destroying the chametz? Is it getting rid of it? Is it that the chametz is a substance that like has to be like not exist? Why should it not exist? Not exist in relation to me or just not exist at all? Or maybe it's just it shouldn't exist so I shouldn't be bothered with it. But if not, any machloket in the Gemara, any machloket in halakha brings us to a deeper understanding of what the halakha is and what it's about, right? That's why in the Mishnah, Masechet Eduyot, when at one point they ask, why do we cite all these opinions of people we disagree with? The Mishnah says, so to understand it better, it's to understand why if there's an opinion we rejected, to know why we rejected it, right? Or to see like, this is a different way of looking at this halakha, and like, we don't go there, but we could go here, and you get a much fuller understanding. And he's saying that this is true not only of the sugya on the page, this is true of things in life, right? For everybody just to disagree, you know, like remember some of you, I know it's Tisha B'Av, which shouldn't say this, but it's from the Monty Python movie Life of Brian, which was about the life of Jesus, which also is about, you know, those of you who are familiar with it know that they clearly read their Josephus, and like much of what they're talking about is the Sinach Chinam that attended the Churban Beit HaMikdash, so I can cite it, right? When at one point, you know, he keeps saying, I'm not the Messiah. And he says, you don't need a Messiah. You all have to think for yourselves. And they all chant, you know, yes, we all have to think for ourselves, right? So what Kook is saying, when the Torah wants peace, the Torah doesn't want the peace of the graveyard. The Torah is seeking harmony, right? Because that is why Shalom is the name of God. Right? Because God is the master of all the world and all its multifariousness and all its directions. If God is the master of is only those parts of the world that agree with one another, right? Well, then he's not much of a God, is he? Now what we're going to see is Rav Kook take this, a crucial innovation of Rav Kook, taking these abstract philosophical ideas and applying them to the political and social movements of his own. So here he's talking, this is an analysis that he gives of Jewish politics in roughly the years right before World War I. Three forces are now wrestling within our camp. Again, some of these passages are very famous. I wouldn't be surprised if some of you have seen them before. At least some of you, maybe all of you. Three forces are now wrestling within our camp. The war is felt more strongly in Eretz Yisrael, but its effects derive from the life of the nation as a whole, and their roots are fixed in an awareness which penetrates the expanses of the human spirit. Basically, what he's going to say is that the three dominant camps in Jewish life of his time, perhaps in our time as well, represent three different spiritual forces at work in the world: the sacred, the nation, and humanity. These are the three central demands which all life, ours, and that of every man in whatever form are composed of. The necessary synthesis of these three great demands must take place in every group which hopes for a future life. what you see what Rav Kook is doing here, he's trying to take the fact of disagreement, and now he's going to do an exercise on himself that's akin to the exercise that he's been asking the reader, so to speak, to do, which is to look deep into disagreement, including angry disagreements, and try to find what are people really agreeing on? How can I frame this in a more positive sense? What are people actually going for here? And what do I have to learn from people who disagree with me? Right? Basically, what he goes on to say is that the three most noted parties in the nation are first the Orthodox, as they are generally called, which carries the banner of the sacred. The second is the New Nationalism, and the third is liberalism. It is well understood that in a healthy situation, all three are needed together. And we all must strive for this healthy situation that each should generously appreciate the positive task of the other, right? I mean, this is a long passage. I'll simply, I'll summarize it. He says, if he looks at the three different groups of the Jewish people of his time, nationalism, by the way, nationalists, Zionists aren't the only nationalists at the time. There's also diaspora nationalists like Simon Dubnow, people who are arguing for Jewish territorial autonomy, like within, you know, Russia, Poland, that sort of thing. And the Orthodox and the liberals. And each one of them sort of takes to heart one crucial feature of what it is to be a human being, right? The nationalists, the nation, the collective, society, the people around me, that, you know, that sort of, that my culture, my people, my group. The liberals, seeing each individual as part of a member of the human race as a whole, and thinking of morality in very universal terms. And the sacred, you know, the Orthodox, those who are concerned above all about with one's relationship with transcendence, with God. Interestingly, he's including he's like including his own camp as one of these other camps. And he says later on that the sacred encompasses them all. And crucially, he says, I need to learn to appreciate the positive sides of the other. Not just like, you know, okay, he's like a crazy, you know, okay, like he's a lunatic liberal, but, you know, he's good to his mother. Oh, well, you know, he's some whacked out nationalist, but he goes to shul sometimes. Oh, well, he's a, you know, a crazy frumach, you know, but sometimes he's okay. No, you're supposed to learn, like, their passions, their zealotry comes from something. You know, the liberal is challenging me to care more about the human race. The nationalist is challenging me to care more about my own people. The member of the camp of the sacred is challenging me to care more about my relationship to God, about something that transcends us all. And later on, he says, the true sacred, he says, our listing the sacred is one of the three. He says, like, sometimes I need to contract myself for the sake of the others. Sometimes I need to like diminish my tribal sense for the sake of humanity or for the sake of my relationship with God. Or I need to somehow almost like put in different proportion my relationship with God for the sake of humanity or for the sake of my tribe, and or vice versa, right? I need to sort of sometimes like put in different proportion my being a member of the human race for carrying those nearest to me, like as Chazal say, Aniyeh Yerchak Kodmim. So, but the sacred is diminished in that way just in terms of its technical sides, which is to say, when he says the technical and practical side of the sacred, which is to say, in like the life of Torah and mitzvot, and especially the politics of religious groups. But the heavenly sacred is the broad subject, which is affecting all this contraction, right? And earlier on, he uses explicit Kabbalistic terminology. He says, "Hakol nichnas tachat kav hamidah." Everything appears along the line of, comes under the line of measure. The line of measure is a Kabbalistic term, referring to sort of like the divine principle integrating and holding in place all the disparate energies of the world. So we see what he's done here is that he takes these ideas that ultimately God's world is good. Anger, pure anger, comes from the void. So like on the way he like condemns anger, but he finds in that like, but if pure anger pauses for a moment, it can, and sort of is willing to like face its own emptiness. Once you face your own emptiness, then you can build. You say, okay, there's something missing here. I need to build something. And he says that this also applies to how we look at people who disagree with us and how we look at other groups who disagree with us. And he challenges us, say, like, if other people are disagreeing with you, see the three groups that he's talking about here, you know, the liberals, the Orthodox, the nationalists, he's not talking about the ones who are just angry all the time. He's talking about the ones who are actually constructively trying to do something. And then I want to leave some time for questions and for a break. Just want to end with this very last meditation of his, which is sort of a way he articulates a powerful spiritual stance of getting to all of this. And that's forgiveness. It's a private reflection. One who grieves constantly for himself, for his sins and the sins of the world, who has forgiven and absolved himself and the whole world, and in so doing draws forgiveness and a light of loving kindness unto all of being, and brings joy to God and his creatures. He must first forgive himself, afterwards cast a broad forgiveness over all, the nearest to him first, on the branches of the roots of the soul, his family, his loved ones, generation and world, and all worlds. And thus is revealed all the good that is hidden away in everything. And he attains the blessing of Abraham, as there is no generation in which his likeness does not emerge. So here too, kindness, love, anger, hatred are spiritual forces in the world, and so is forgiveness. Our inner lives are part of the life of the world. If I can bring myself to forgive another person, I've brought more forgiveness into the world. If I can forgive myself, so I can start anew, soon we're going to be entering Kodesh Elul, I can bring forgiveness into the world, face my own emptiness, and not respond in anger, but start anew. And I'd be happy to take questions before we take a break.
All right, if you look, thank you very much. If you see the questions in the chat box, I can tell you they're just really a couple questions I see so far. But let's. How do the disciples of Rav Kook, who are rather one-dimensional, explain the need for opposites? How can they claim to have the answers on all matters? There has been, I guess, a shifting away from Rav Kook.
Well, once again, there's just one thing I need. There's one chat I absolutely have to answer on a personal note. And then we'll. So, how to interpret Rav Kook's legacy is a complicated. I'm giving one interpretation, of course. I mean, I want to be fair. You know, I want to be fair. One time, years ago, I taught this text somewhere, and I taught the text about the three camps, which I teach a great deal. And afterwards, somebody came up to me and said, "Wow, you know, that was really great. That was really interesting. You know, just last week I was someplace, and Rob gave a shiur on that text, and he was like from a different school of Rav Kook thought, and the lesson teacher from that text was that we, the true disciples of Rav Kook, have the inside track and understand everybody very well. So yes, these texts are open to different sorts of interpretations. I think that even within different disciples of Rav Kook, I mean, obviously, sort of more pluralizing, let's call it, readings. Though I think, in fairness, what they would probably say is that Rav Kook still maintains that there is an inside track, so to speak. There is an interior, that there is an esoteric understanding of the process. I mean, I think to say, if we're talking about people like Rav Tao, I think we'll, somebody like Rav Tao will say, Rav Tao is very important leader of what's called the Chardali, the Haredi Leumi wing, and he's the spiritual father of many the pre-military academies. He will say, what Rav Kook is saying here is that there's still an esoteric dimension of understanding that he thought that he had, that the others didn't have, and this is true. I mean, in some sense, Rav Kook thought that he was somehow above these debates, that he was sort of panoramic related to them. And on that basis, I can stand here and I can make my decision. I can sort of act accordingly. Others would tell you, on the one hand, like there's, Rav Kook lived a long time ago. So like a lot of, the obvious question here is, what does all this have to do in the world after the Holocaust? And that's a good question. I mean, I think it means that, like, These things need to be taken, I think the Holocaust places a great question mark on all of this, and we just have to work with the appropriate humility given that the Holocaust places a question mark on everything. But others might tell you, well, when Rav Kook is writing this, he's not talking about like the Meshuggah left-wingers of today. He's talking about people like, Beryl Katznelson. When he says liberals and all that, he means people like Louis Brandeis. He means people like Beryl Katznelson. When he's talking about Jewish nationalists, he means good Zionists. He doesn't mean Nar Gvaot, or he doesn't mean, crazy people. Or others. So those are the ways in which they understand it. But yeah, also I think that Kook did not see himself as a sectoral thinker. He never belonged to a political party. He never joined the Zionist movement. He never belonged to a political party. It's also one of the reasons why he was rather unsuccessful as a political actor. The chief rabbinate really went nowhere in his lifetime, in part because he was unwilling to align himself with any political parties, because he always wanted to stay above the fray. His successors, Rav Herzog and Rav Uziel, were very, very, very great men. Very great men from whom we have a lot to learn. But they made a choice to explicitly align themselves with a political party, with the Mizrahi. As a result, they got budgets and they got political support, and they were able to build their institutions. So in a sense, it's a hard thing. Like once you choose sides in political debate, you have to make choices and you have to make allies, you have to make enemies. I still think Rav Kook's perspective can help guide you. But yes, I'm somebody who would argue that Rav Kook's legacy has been extremely sectoralized and diminished to my mind, in many ways. And I say that with a lot of respect to the people who with all due respect to the people with whom I'm disagreeing, and I respectfully disagree with them. Yeah, but also just finally, one last thing is Rav Kook is a large and capacious thinker. Like all large and capacious thinkers, his ideas admit of multiple legacies. Yeah, do we have any time for any more? Or should we take a break?
Probably not. Let's I'm sorry, it's 12:57. I want to take a 3-minute break.